So thank you all for joining today's seminar. It's a pleasure to have Professor Saptarshi Das with us here today from Penn State University. So Professor Das is the Ackley Professor of Engineering in the Department of Engineering Science and Mechanics and has many other affiliations within Penn State University. He joined Penn State in 2016, and prior to that was a postdoctoral research scholar and then an assistant research scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. His group is focused on 2D microelectronics for monolithic 3D integration, bio-inspired sensing, neuromorphic computing, and hardware security, some of which today we're going to learn about. We're very excited. And Professor Das has received awards, including the Young Investigator Award from the United States Air Force Office of Scientific Research, as well as the National Science Foundation Career Award. So with that, feel free to ask questions throughout. Whoever is listening to us online, please type your questions. I will moderate on your behalf and ask the questions. Thank you for joining us, and we're very excited to listen to your talk.
Thank you, Farnaj, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to all of you about some of our most recent work on, as you can see from the title, the AI for 2D materials and 2D materials for AI. And I will see, a reason for me to come up with this particular title. But before I go into the technical part of the talk, maybe a little bit about myself. I did all my schooling back in India. I grown up in a town called Kolkata, which is in the eastern part of India. Then I did my undergraduate also from India in Jadavpur University in Electronics and Telecommunication before coming to the United States to do my PhD from Purdue. And after that, I spent a couple of years in the Argonne National Lab as a postdoctoral scholar and as an assistant scientist. And then I kind of joined Penn State as a tenure track faculty. I have been there for almost 8.5 years now. I would also like to acknowledge all my funding agencies and definitely all my students who are doing all the hard work and really an amazing group of motivated students who kind of are the main pillar of whatever success that comes to the group. So my group has the focus of looking into neuromorphic or brain-inspired computing. That's like one of the fundamental principles that drives our group, and we use mostly 2D materials for that. Although a lot of principles that we are using can be also applied to oxide-based transistors and even perovskite materials. But our focus has been 2D materials, and I will tell you some of the key advantages of 2D materials. We also look into specific circuits found in animal brains. I will give you a couple of examples today. So we designed these brain-inspired circuits. And more recently, we have started looking into 3D integration with the idea that brain ultimately is a three-dimensional structure, and if we can do computation in a three-dimensional architecture, it can actually bring a lot of energy efficiency to the computing. And then finally, we also look into machine learning. Of course, one of our ideas is to make the next generation of artificial neural network, deep neural networks, energy efficient because they are not at a sustainable path. But we also use their power in order to kind of mitigate some of the challenges with the 2D materials. And that is the part I call, the AI for 2D materials. And today's talk will actually start with that aspect. How do we use the AI to kind of enhance the performance of a 2D material based sensor? In this case, we call it a graphene tongue, which is used for kind of robust chemical analysis. Of course, the tongue doesn't look like this. This is again AI generated by ChatGPT. The tongue looks much simpler and not that exciting over there. This is like simple graphene transistors, very small, even smaller than probably a quarter. And we use this particular graphene device for a specific application, which is related to really food, because food is a very complex chemical. If you think about the juices, the milk, whatever we eat is actually a very complex chemical. So analyzing those chemicals using this platform gives us a little bit confidence about the power of both machine learning and the hardware piece that we are developing. Now, when it comes to food, I think the inspiration comes from the best sensor out there for food, which is probably our tongue, right? And the tongue is kind of quite interesting because if you think about the taste receptors in the tongue, there are only 5 different types of taste receptors, which can broadly categorize, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, which is the taste of meat, and salty, right? But if you think about the tongue in general, we can figure out the difference between a chocolate cake and a cheesecake, both being sweet, right? Or, if you train your tongue, it can also differentiate between very subtle differences between different types of wine, right? So although our taste receptors, the hardware piece is very limited, the gustatory cortex is actually pretty elaborate, which helps us to kind of get, more ideas about, similar types of chemical. One more important thing, what we kind of got very motivated about is the fact that, in the animal kingdom, no 2 tongues are identical. I think my tongue and your tongue are completely different, but if we are given a pork or a chicken to eat, both of us, if we are meat eater, will be able to tell what is a pork and what is a meat, right? So in spite of differences between the tongues, which is the variation from one device to the other, one hardware piece to the other, we can categorize the same, thing that we are eating. And this is kind of going to be very important going forward because most of the nanomaterial based sensors do not really make it to the commercialization because of this problem of variation, right? Device to device, cycle to cycle. So the question is, since the nature can do it, can we adopt the same principle for our chemisensors as well? Now, there is one more important piece about the tongue, right? The question is whether human beings have the best tongue or not. What differentiate, 2 different tongues in the kingdom, animal kingdom? So the 5 types of taste receptor is common across all the tongues, but there are also number of taste receptors that matters. And if you look into a chicken, the chicken has got only 25 total taste receptors, although there are like all 5 types, okay, so 5 of each. So this is not the best tongue. Of course, the chicken only feeds on very limited kind of food, right? The cat has 400, the dog has got 2000, human has got 10,000. But the question is, are we the best tongue out there? And the answer is no. The best tongue is actually a catfish. The catfish has got 200,000 taste receptors, and its entire body is actually taste receptor. And what it allows it to do is to find out very small changes in the underwater aquatic environment to find a predatory action, because aquatic environment is chemically extremely chaotic. And yet it can get a very high sensitivity and selectivity because of the large number of taste receptors it has got, which is nothing but having a lot of information from the same environment. So more taste receptors allows you to collect, more information. So now we kind of look into the same principle and design our graphene-based electronic tongue, which is simple graphene transistors. And one thing which is quite interesting about graphene is once you put a liquid on top of this graphene, there is this electric double layer that forms at the interface, and that carries the chemical signature of the species that you are putting on top, and that then get translated into the IV characteristics of graphene. I am pretty sure that you have all seen this kind of graphene characteristics. And then, as I will tell you, we use this entire machine learning in order to kind of analyze this entire IV characteristics to identify different chemicals. Now, let me state you the problem with this graphene chemisensor. So here I have a single graphene device, and we do pH sensing, and you can see wonderful, nice results for each pH. The characteristics is distinct, and therefore we can say that we have made an amazing pH sensor. Okay, and this work has been going on for a long time, But the problem in next day, if you measure the same device, okay, the device characteristics has drifted a little bit. So your sensitivity has now gone down, and if you measure it with across multiple different sensors that you have fabricated, you have even more device to device variation, and now you can see that between pH 4, 5 and 6, everything appears to be the same. So if I give an unknown solution, right, and if you measure a Dirac point, you won't be able to tell whether it is pH 4 or 5. So we lost our sensitivity to the fact that there's a lot of device to device, cycle to cycle, manufacturing to manufacturing variation. The question is now, how can we mitigate that? Now, one question we could ask is that should we look into the Dirac point, as our indicator of a change in the chemical solution, or should we look into some of the other parameters? There's a huge list of parameters that you can extract, right? The minimum current, the maximum current, the on-off ratio, because it's a transistor, so you can really extract a lot of information. But even if I do that and look into, how each of these parameter kind of changes as a function of, all this device-to-device variation, I can probably go ahead and rank them. And I can find that, oh, okay, V Dirac has the rank 5, but I Dirac is rank 1, and that's good. But then even with the first rank, figure of merit, I don't get to 100% accuracy because it is still drifting. Okay. Now, what we could do is we could do some very simple machine learning where we say that, okay, instead of looking into one parameter at a time, why don't we combine 3 different quantities? Let's say the top 3, and there you see that you get clustering of the data. This is k nearest neighbor algorithm, and you get to almost 100% accuracy once you get to 5 different parameters that you look into at the same time. But the question is, here all these parameters that we are extracting are based on human derived knowledge, right? But are we the best to extract information from a data set? So what we did is, we kind of thought about, instead of extracting this Dirac point, minimum current ourselves, why don't we give the entire IV characteristics to the convolution neural network, which is generally very good in order to extract features, and then see whether it can classify the different pHs or not. And you can see immediately the accuracy goes to 98% without us going into all this elaborate exercise of finding out which are the best figure of merits. Right? And this is in spite of having those device to device and sensor to sensor and time to time, cycle to cycle variation, right? So now this is all good, but when the question that we ask is that, okay, we all know artificial neural networks are black boxes, they perform very well, but we never know why do they perform very well. So then we looked into things called these shapely features to identify which part of the graphene characteristics the network is focusing on in order to really do such an amazing job in terms of being a pH sensor. And what we found is that if you can compare the pH 4, you see that these blue regions are all activated for pH 4, while other regions are activated for different pH values, which means that the network is not looking into a single parameter, but into a part of this IV characteristics in a very subtle manner, because the weight for each of these point is different. And there is no mathematical definition of how do I describe a part of these characteristics. And this is precisely why the network works so much better, because it looks into very subtle changes in the IV characteristics, which is beyond mathematical description. Right? So we get a very high accuracy because of this interesting aspect. And you can do is you can actually take 3-4 chip, train the device on those, and then test it on a completely newly fabricated chip, and still you get very high accuracy number, which means that you don't have to make billions of chips, and on each chip you have to do separate training, right? Then it will not be commercializable. So that's also very good that you can do the training on a different chip and then the testing on the other. Then we thought about, okay, pH is a very simple topic, right? Because the pH gives you really observable changes in the IV characteristics. But what about milk and adulterating it with water? Because when you adulterate milk with water, the pH does not change. So if you have a pH sensor, you will not be able to detect adulteration of milk. But then what we did is we did the same principle. We measured a lot of device with different milk adulteration percentage, and then train the machine learning model and look at the accuracy of it being telling you what is the adulteration percentage. Now, adulteration percentage is not really a classification problem, it's more of a regression problem, because you don't know whether you will be adulterating with 10% or 20% or 3.5% of water. And then we also trained a regression based model, and we found that still it gives you an accuracy within 2 to 3% of milk adulteration, right? The same principle. And you can actually expand it to different Coke, coffee, milk. And one thing you notice is that it's the same exact graphene device without any functionalization. Because generally when we try to develop a sensor for milk, we need to know what in milk makes it milk, and then go ahead and functionalize your graphene device, or what in Coke makes it Coke and functionalize. We are not functionalizing this. We are simply collecting a lot of data from many different graphene sensors and then training the model and telling them this is Coke versus this is zero sugar versus Pepsi, right? Because these are chemically very similar, right? And yet the network is able to learn and distinguish and does a very, very good job in there. Okay, and then we look into even more deeper problems. Let's say, for example, different fruit juices and as they degrade over time. Because now it is just not the juice, but also the different bacterial or fungi activity, because the reason a juice degrade is different for different juices, right? Orange juice may degrade because of oxidation processes, but pineapple juice may degrade because there might be more fungi activity happening. So if you really need to know whether a juice is 2-day old or 3-day old, first you need to know the chemistry that goes on in degrading that fruit juice, and then try to kind of target that particular molecule and then figure out whether it is degraded or not. We are not doing anything like that. We are simply collecting data from different juices over different days and training the machine learning model. We use a different type of network architecture, and then it can tell you, whether what juice it is and also, how old it is, right? So this is where I feel like the power of artificial neural network can really mitigate a lot of real life problem with all the nano sensors that we are developing, because now I don't really need to make the perfect sensor. I can deal with imperfection by taking help from this neural network, right? This is the part where I kind of say that AI can be useful for 2D materials. Now I will switch gear. So this is the AI for 2D materials. If you're interested, you can go and read our paper. We just published this a few months back. Now I'm going to 2D materials for AI, right? And in this context, as I told you that we are not only looking into synapses and neurons, that's how the basic abstract of artificial neural network is, but we are focusing on the unique architecture found in different animal brains, because these animals are really very good in sensory computation, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first example is this locust. And locusts, fly in a swarm, and a single swarm can consist up to 1 million locusts. They all fly together but never collide with each other, right? So they are really naturally avoiding collision. So therefore, we can really, and there's a single neuron in the brain of the locust, which is called this lobula giant movement detector neuron, which actually helps it to avoid collision, right? So a single neuron is avoiding collision, and that's what makes it extremely energy efficient, right? And we have flying drones, autonomous cars. We have collision avoidance systems today, but they're very bulky, energy inefficient. So can we learn from locust and design something for collision avoidance? So now let's see what the locust does in order to avoid collision. So it has a compound eye. You can see that those photoreceptor cells. So whenever an object approaches the locust eye, it uses two kinds of stimulus. One is the angular projection, which is theta, which increases as the object comes closer, and the other is the angular velocity, which is theta prime, which is just the differential of the same information. Now this LGMD neuron has got two branches, as you can see. The blue dendritic branch takes the angular velocity information and creates an excitatory response, which means that as the object comes closer, the response increases, which is quite natural. But what the red dendritic branch does is quite interesting, because it takes the angular projection information, which also increases as the object comes closer, but it creates an inhibitory response. Look at the red curve. So the response goes down as the object comes closer, and that is counterintuitive. Why would a response go down when something is about to collide with you? Then what the LGMD neuron does, it kind of multiplies the two and creates a non-monotonic firing sequence where the firing frequency becomes maximum right before the collision is going to take place, and that gives the locust enough time to fly out in a different direction, right? So you can see it's a very simple architecture. So we thought about, okay, why don't we go and simply mimic this architecture? So we kind of did that, and I'm going to go through this. So we created this inhibitory module, excitatory module, and the escape module using our 2D material based devices. So let's say, for example, we have a car, and the car is approaching your sensor. And as the car comes closer, the intensity of the headlight that is falling on the sensor is going to increase. And you can see over here, if the car is moving faster, then the intensity will go high earlier. If the cars are moving slower, the intensity will go higher later, right? But this information alone is not good enough for you to avoid collision, because it's a monotonic information. So what we do is we actually used a circuit which is kind of inspired by the locust, but works in a very different principle. So this, if you can recollect, it's an inverter. Okay, which means that if your input is low, the output is high, and if your output is high, the input is low. It's just an inverter, and generally a CMOS inverter will not respond to light. If you shine light on a CMOS inverter, it will remain the same, right? As long as you're not changing the biasing condition to that inverter. But now this inverter is very special because it has got this MOS2 transistor in the bottom, right? And this MOS2 transistor responds to light. And whenever you shine light on this MOS, it's a direct bandgap material. You have photogenerated carriers, electron hole pairs, and then these holes get trapped into the underlying oxide, and that changes the threshold voltage of the MOS2 transistor. Now, as the threshold voltage of this lower transistor is changing, so will be the inverter response. In a static condition, just by shining light, the inverter response keeps changing, and as you keep shining it, the you can see that the response is going towards the left. So, after some time, the state of the inverter changes from high to low as the threshold crossovers. So, this is almost very similar to an inhibitory response. Although the light intensity is increasing, the response of your device is initially high and later low, and based on how fast the car is appearing or approaching, you get a earlier versus a late response. So, now we have created the inhibition. We still have to create the excitatory response. So, how do we do that? You just cascade two inverters. The inverse of an inverse will give you, now it is a buffer circuit, and if you shine light on the same thing, now you will create an excitatory response where the response is low initially and eventually becomes high as the light comes closer and closer. So, now I got both inhibition and excitation. The final job is to multiply the two, and that is easy. I simply use an AND gate, because AND gate is a logical multiplier, and if I do that, I get the spike, and the spike happens earlier for a faster moving car and later for a slower moving car. So, it is kind of using the same algorithm that the locust uses, but designing it using our solid state devices, using in-sensor computing capability to get to very low power collision avoidance system. Right? So, that is one example where we can actually learn from nature. Now, let us look into the second example. The second example going from vision to hearing. So, here we are looking into barn owl, because this is one of the barn owl hunts in complete darkness. So, it relies not on its eyes, but on its hearing capability to find a prey, or even escape from the predators. But the reason it can localize sound with a precision of almost 1 to 3 degree, and I do not know, I kind of got excited about our ears after learning about barn owl, is that why do we have 2 ears, why not 1 for hearing? And one thing that is true about having 2 ears is that whenever a sound approaches from a particular direction, it reaches the 2 ears with a certain time gap. For example, if the sound is coming from right, it will reach your right ear first and the left ear later. So, there is a finite time difference between the time reaching your 2 ears. Now, the problem is this time difference is generally of the order of hundreds of microsecond for barn owl, which has a smaller head, to maybe a millisecond for elephant, which has a bigger head, right, because the velocity of sound is pretty fast, right, and our head is too small. So, now you are trying to solve this temporal problem, which is in hundreds of microsecond, using neurons which can only fire every few milliseconds, right. That is a very difficult computational problem to solve. So, how do we do it? You actually convert or use a neural architecture that converts the temporal information into a spatial map. So, how does it do it? It has this organization of neurons. It uses 2 types of neurons. These red neurons are called the coincidence neuron. They kind of fire every time they receive the information from the top and bottom neuron at the same time, while the black ones are called the delay neurons. They simply convert the acoustic information into electrical spikes and brings it to the the delay neuron. So, let us look into this demonstration. Now, let us say for example, the sound is coming from straight ahead. It will reach both ears at the same time, and will propagate the same distance, and the coincidence will occur at the middle. But if the sound comes from the right side, then it will reach the right ear first. There will be longer propagation in the branch below and shorter in the top, and therefore, the coincidence will happen at a different location. So, just by knowing where did the coincidence took place, you can tell which direction the sound came from. Right? That is a very interesting architecture to do sound localization. We actually went ahead and did that, but in this particular case we use a special transistor which we call a split gated transistor, which does not have only one gate, but it has multiple gates, and there is a small gap between the gates. And you can see there are many gates in this transistor. So, what happens is that this transistor could only be turned off if you have the voltages applied to the same color gate at the same time. So, the top and bottom electrodes work as a coincidence neuron, okay. But at the same time, you can see there is a small gap between these top and bottom electrodes, which means you can never completely turn off the transistor, right, because there is a small gap which is not under gate control. So, but you can see that for the blue one, I can turn it off better compared to the green one because of the fringing electric field, right? So what happens is that, whenever you get the spikes at the same top and bottom neuron, there is a drop in the current, right? But the magnitude of the drop depends upon which color this coincidence took place. So this is almost like a mixed signal device which does digital computation in the vertical direction and analog computation in the horizontal direction to mimic the architecture found in the barn owl's brain. And with that, we can now get to very high precision in these devices. Okay, we can get down to almost like 0.01 degree precision, and we are also not restricted to acoustic wave. You can use the entire electromagnetic radiation spectrum because you just need the right transducer to convert that into electrical spikes and then use the architecture for detecting. So this is another example. Now I will switch gear a little bit. So we do a lot of these animals. For example, we look into octopus for multisensory integration. If you're interested, you can look into this paper. We also look into dragonfly for probabilistic computing. We have done a lot of work using 2D materials to get all these Gaussian characteristics, stochastic computing. And in many computational problems, we don't need an accurate solution. An approximate solution is good enough, and that is something nature has already figured out even before Bayes came out with the Bayes theorem. So we kind of mimic those principles in these kind of devices. But for the last part of my talk, I'm going to focus more about the future of computing, and why 2D material is something that we are using for the future of computing and trying to do all the neuromorphic with 2D material. I mean, which we all know that we are transitioning from FinFET technology very soon into gate-all-around and eventually to CFET or nanosheet technology. And the main idea behind that is that you need to have better gate electrostatics. More gate you put around your transistor, the better your transistor performance will become. So you not only make the transistor oxide very thin, but you also try to put it gate all around. But in order to do that, you also need to have the channel being very thin, right? And you cannot really make silicon too thin because of the fact that the mobility of silicon kind of goes down the drain when you make it a monolayer or 1 nanometer thick. You can't even have a manufacturable technique to make 1 nanometer silicon. Although very recently in IEDM, I think there were demonstrations showing that 1.5 nanometer of silicon films can be made. So our competition gets tougher, but we are not going to lose the hope with the 2D material. But the idea is that the 2D material can offer you much higher mobility numbers, so the better transport in the channel at the similar thickness, which your silicon or any bulk material cannot provide. So eventually, if you think about 2D material, they're the ultimate choice for any transistor. Now, even if you kind of make the transistor very, very small, ultimately you are going to be limited by the lithography tools, right? I mean, you cannot make a transistor which is 2 or 3 nanometer in length. That's not going to be possible with the lithography tools. So ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to start doing 3D integration because you have to start stacking devices on top of each other if you really need to get more transistors in the same footprint. So 3D integration is probably the ultimate way to reinstate Moore's law, and I think in MIT, Professor Kim's group is working a lot on this 3D integration. Now, this is very difficult to do with silicon logic because of the fact that at the back end, I cannot really get high performance silicon, and therefore I lose all the wonderful quality that the silicon provides. Although this is something that has already happened for the memory industry, because for the memory, silicon is just a readout channel. I don't really care about the high performance from those memory devices. So you can really stack these. And this is something that is not possible currently with silicon technology, or it's going to be extremely expensive. But the 2D material gives you an opportunity to do the 3D integration because you can really either grow these 2D materials on a different wafer and keep transferring them and making transistors. So you are really not bound to the substrate. And that is literally what we are kind of exploiting. And then I think 3D integration, as I told you, is just not to make more transistor. You can also start putting different functionalities in every layer, right? From sensing, storage, logic, and that way you can mitigate this von Neumann bottleneck or this memory wall problem of shuttling data between different sensors and compute units, which kind of cost a lot of energy. So 3D integration is good for both more as well as more than more application. And although industry is looking into to a different way of doing this heterogeneous integration using packaging technology. They're putting different chiplets together using interposer. But eventually, to have the highest density of interconnection, you have to go monolithic 3D integration, because of the fact that when you do through silicon vias, the via dimension can only be tens of micrometer, maybe down to a micrometer. But when you do it in a monolithic manner, you can really have the vias as small as your transistor interconnects. And that's why monolithic integration is the best way of getting highest transistor interconnectivity, which is the key for 3D integration. So this is something that we are doing at Penn State. We are working with two types of 2D material. Our focus is currently on, for the channel, we are working on N-type MOS2 and P-type tungsten selenide. These are right now grown on sapphire substrate at 800 to 1000 degrees centigrade epitaxially. We get very good quality 2D material over 2-inch wafer. Very soon we are going to have capability of doing it on the 4-inch wafers. And then we go ahead and transfer this material using this PMMA assisted transfer process, which still requires more optimization. But the end story is that we can actually start making thousands and thousands of devices to start looking into their uniformity, yield, and variation from devices to devices. So this is our first, we kind of published this paper last year, where we were able to, for the first time, demonstrate monolithic integration of 2D transistors. Here you are seeing a chip which has 30,000 transistors in 2 tiers. Each tier has got 30,000 transistors. The total number is 60,000. We were able to also scale these devices down to channel length of 45 nanometer. We can go down to 20 nanometer. It's just that the yield kind of goes down with shorter channel length devices. And we don't even stop at only stacking 2 tiers of devices. We can stack 3 tiers of transistors on top of each other. And you can see the clear advantage. The transistor footprint remains the same, while I'm simply increasing the number of transistors. I kind of stack them on top of each other. And as I told you, now you can connect your transistors in the bottom and the top tier by the via, which is sitting right next to the transistor. Right? That's the key advantage of doing 3D integration in a monolithic manner. We actually measured a lot of transistors. These are 10,000 transistors in tier 1, and you can see the distribution of these devices across the wafer. Our performances in this type of devices were not as high. Towards the end of this talk, I will talk about some of the high performance transistors that we have made. These are tier 1 transistors, this is tier 2 transistors. What I'm saying is that the 2D material is maturing to scale, right? We can actually now demonstrate large area, large number of transistors. These are scale devices. Scale devices show more variation, so we need to have a lot of improvement in our lithography in order to get to scale devices with more uniformity. And these are some cross-sectional TM images showing MOS2 in all the 3 tiers. These are the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 devices for the NMOS, but we can also do it with tungsten selenide, and then it is a PMOS device, right? So we have both NMOS and PMOS stacked in 3 tiers. So that's the first round of our demonstration, and remember, each of these device also has a memory integrated with them, because we are having this flash kind of memory architecture where we have alumina, hafnia alumina, where the small band gap material can charge traps sandwiched between 2 large band gap material when you apply voltages. So these are all in-memory computing capable devices. You can see the memory ratio, memory retention, and to some extent also the memory endurance in these devices, right? And these devices, I told you earlier, are also sensitive to light, so you can also use them as photosensor. So now you have integrated logic, sensing, and computing in all these 30,000 transistors which are there across these different tiers. So that is really both transistor scaling as well as functionality scaling. Now moving forward, I also like to thank 4 of my students, because this was not trivial at all, because the total number of lithography steps that it required was actually 38. And doing this number of lithography steps in an academic environment and making sure everything works is really non-trivial. I can simply say we are putting transistors on top of each other, but it is not trivial. And a lot of you actually do this every day, so you will be able to appreciate it more. So now next step is that, okay, so now we have got unipolar transistors stacked on top of together. Can we do CMOS capability? So we found that tungsten selenide is a very interesting material, because if you put nickel contact and if you do alumina capping, you get a very nice N-type characteristics from tungsten selenide. But if you change it to palladium as the contact and hafnia as a capping layer, then you get a very nice p-type characteristic. So now I have both n and p characteristics from the same material. So can't we start building 3D CMOS capability? So here is our first demonstration of a 3D CMOS. Now we are going beyond inverter. We are trying to make more complex circuits. In this case, an NAND gate which has two NMOS transistors in the tier 1, and then they are connected through this via to the two top transistors which are p-type in tier 2. So now we can start looking into really the advantage of 3D integration, and you can see over here that the via is connecting transistor to transistor. This is something you cannot do with through silicon via technology or heterogeneous integration, right? So the main advantage of 3D kind of shows up over here. So and you can see each transistor also has this memory, so it's like in-memory compute capability with 3D CMOS. And then we also demonstrated other kinds of logic gates. One thing I would mention, the yield of these logic gates were pretty poor. Okay, only 10% to 20% of these logic gates actually worked, but they worked. So this was the first demonstration of a 3D CMOS capability. And as I told you that industry is taking this heterogeneous integration aspect, and today they have been able to achieve the via pitch of 1 micrometer after so many years of investment. And this IO density is a key parameter that's going to be benchmarking going forward for the 3D. And you can see even in an academic environment, our first generation, or even these are not even Gen 0 devices, maybe Gen -1 devices can achieve integration density which can compete with the 3D packaging technology. So that's the advantage of monolithic 3D integration. And then as I told you, right, this doesn't have to stop in only CMOS transistors. We can actually now place graphene devices on the top tier, which could be good for chemi-sensing application, and MOS2 devices in the bottom tier for logic. So you can now do near sensor computing. So here is a chip which has graphene transistors on top and MOS2 transistors in the bottom. You can see, look at the cross-sectional TEM, and you can see that the graphene devices are sitting right on top of your MOS2 transistors. So you can really do now in sensor or near sensor compute. With this chip, we did a very quick demonstration. We put a liquid droplet, and as the droplet evaporates, the concentration of salt in that droplet changes. That changes the response of the graphene device in an analog manner, and then we took that analog information and digitized it using some MOS2 based comparator circuit. So very simple application, but you can see the potential of integrating heterogeneous material now in this 3D stack. So that was another example. This also I think we just published 2 months back. And then again, it doesn't have to only restrict to just 2D material. As I was telling at the very beginning of my talk, you can also start stacking 2D and 3D materials. Like for example, a lot of work that my collaborator Professor Jalani is doing at University of Minnesota has to do with perovskites material, and he is able to grow this using this hybrid MBE technique on a sacrificial layer which is lattice matched. So therefore, you get a very good quality of STO film, but now you can dissolve that strontium oxide in water, and you can create a nanomembrane of these perovskites. So now you can start taking this perovskite material and start stacking them with the 2D material, and in that way you enable newer functionalities. So in this kind of a device, we found that we have something called incipient ferroelectricity, where you get this counterclockwise hysteresis in the MOS2 gated by STO. We got some polar order from the second harmonic generation measurement, but one thing which was not very good was the retention was very poor, because in FET you should have two polarization states that are stable, but because it is an incipient ferroelectric material, it kind of depolarizes very quickly. But what we found is that this material, when you cool it down to low temperature, the memory states becomes extremely stable. So we went out to 100 Kelvin and even 15 Kelvin, and we found that it could be a very good alternative for cryogenic memory, because in a cryogenic condition, charged up memories may not work as well, and for a lot of quantum applications, you will need cryogenic memory devices. So we went down to 15 Kelvin, and we found that this device is actually an excellent memory device at low temperature with good long-term retention. Switching speed is less than 20 nanosecond, reasonably fast, and you can also store almost 64 discrete states in a single device. It's almost like 5-bit to 6-bit of memory stored in a single device. So that's also another interesting area that I think is going to be absolutely interesting going forward. So you can kind of see the importance of 3D integration and what we have been able to accomplish so far. Now I will, for the last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about high performance devices, because all the devices I showed you so far are pretty low in performance, right? I mean, tens of microamps of current to hundreds of microamps of current. So, and I'm talking about replacing silicon with this 2D material. So you can see that the requirement for the high performance devices is that you need to have more than a milliamp per micrometer on state current from both N and P, and your parasitic capacitance has to be low, because parasitic capacitance has been a under studied topic in the 2D community. And then one more important thing is that the low power application requires your supply voltage to be less than 1 volt. Your off current has to be 0 or low at Vg equal to 0, and that is something not really addressed in the 2D community. You will see a large on off ratio, but the devices gets turned off for a very negative Vg for the NFET and very positive voltage for the PFET. Okay, so and if you have that, you can never design circuit. Okay, so circuit designer will never be interested in 2D material. So that's going to be very important. Of course, you need to reduce device to device variation, otherwise you cannot make circuits either. So we have started looking into this. So these are our most recent results on MOS2. I think right now there is a consensus that antimony is the best contact material for 2D materials. I mean, bismuth is also very good. Here we are using gold, and that's why we don't reach as high performance as like milliamps per micrometer, but we get to consistently 300 microamps per micrometer on 1000 devices, right. So large number of devices now we have been able to get to very high on state current, and we have been able to reduce the off current at Vg equal to 0. The on off ratio always existed with the 2D material, but what we could not do is to bring down the off current to low values at Vg equal to 0. So we were able to do that with doing some growth optimization, and you can kind of see that the device to device variation has also gone down quite a bit. And then you can do all this statistical plot, and you can see that the threshold voltage variation is actually quite low. And if you compare it with the existing silicon technology, it is getting there. It's still not there. I will show you some more slides on that. And then when you compare it, this is a plot I wanted to draw your attention to, that you see, I mean, many devices show very high on state current, but they cannot turn off their device at Vg equal to 0, because the right corner for you to be in this extreme right hand plot is the upper left hand corner, right, because you need to have both high on current and large on off ratio or low off current at Vg equal to 0. And that is something that has not been really achieved. Okay, you can get high on current, but you cannot turn off this device. So threshold engineering becomes extremely important. But you can see that we have been able to get to the corner where TSMC and Intel are. I mean, TSMC and Intel are still a little bit better than us. Okay, and our champion device get up to almost like 300 microns per micrometer current. So that is NFET. Now what has been struggling in the community for quite a bit is the PFET, right? PFET performances have been even poorer. But we have now been able to achieve similar performing PFET. So our PFET currents are also now of the order of 250 to 300 microamps per micrometer, and we have been able to do that with something we are using called the NO doping. So we have defect passivation, because defect was actually really creating a lot of problem with tungsten selenide. With NO doping, we are able to passivate these selenium vacancies, and we are able to get to very high performance. Device to device variation is also quite low. And you can see that even for the PFETs are off at Vg equal to 0, because that's what I need to make circuits. And again, when you compare it with all the other literature, now you can see that this is probably the best result in literature for the PFET, because we get both very high on current as well as large on off ratio, right. So now we have both the high performance NMOS and PMOS with the right threshold voltage. So now we can start moving into making more reasonable circuits. So we have started now building using PDKs. So now we are using the layout design that you will use for a particular technology node. So we are using right now 200 nanometer, 192 nanometer technology node, and we are now designing all the circuits like NAND, NOR, and you can see they work all with 3 volt. And here I would also like to mention that because a lot of people are looking into oxides, your gate voltage is generally 20 volts, 30 volts. Remember, our VDD has to be low for both the source drain voltage as well as the gate voltage. Unless you do that, your circuits are not going to work, right? So you also need to scale the oxide. So all the data that I showed you were with UOT numbers of 2.3 nanometer. So we have been using 10 nanometer or 5 nanometer hafnium oxide, and we are able to get down to really low voltage operation of this transistor, and that is why we can now make the circuits operate. So these are NAND and NOR gates, XOR gate, which requires more transistors, multiplexers, D flip-flops, because you do not only need combinatorial circuits, you also need sequential circuits, right, for in order to design a computer. So we can make D flip-flop, we can also make SRAMs, right. These are the very basic component of a building a computer using 2D material. So now we have all the basic components. So what left to be done is to make the computer. So here is the first demonstration of a 2D CMOS computer, which has all the sequential and combinatorial circuits. You have D flip-flop, arithmetic logic unit, and we are using a single instruction set computer. This is the ultimate version of a RISC processor. The RISC processor is reduced instruction set processor. If you go down to one instruction, right, you can do all operation, it just takes longer time. Okay, and we are also designing it for 1 bit. This is not a 32-bit computer, right? I mean, that will be too much. So we designed this entire computer. So here is this entire computer over here, which has 72 NMOS and 72 PMOSs. You can see the PMOS and NMOS sitting right next to each other right now, because we can transfer them and make all these devices on ultra thin oxides, and this actually works. Okay, so we can actually make a single instruction set computer work, and here are the timing diagrams of this 2D CMOS computer. This is the first demonstration of a 2D CMOS computer, but then we fail in something, and this is what I wanted to highlight this. Look at the speed of these devices. They are working at hundreds of microseconds. I don't think Intel, TSMC, anybody will be interested if the speed is so poor, right? But then, why are we limited on speed? We are not limited on the speed from a fundamental device point of view. We are restricted by the parasitic capacitances, which our community has not really paid a lot of attention to. Okay, we have a lot of measurement capacitance, big pads, that we are using for measuring these devices. So we thought about, okay, that we figured out. So what about we do some modeling of the devices. So this is the industry standard BSIM bulk model, which was developed by Chengming Hu, right, from UC Berkeley, and the industry uses this model. So any new transistor technology, you should be able to match it to this BSIM bulk model, and you can see that our experimental characteristics matches very well with the BSIM bulk. Once we have it, we can start doing SPICE simulation, right, because then that will tell me if I were to reduce all my parasitic capacitances, what will be my projected performance? And we found that if you can get down to a femtofarad of capacitance, your speed actually becomes tens of picosecond, right? So today we are not limited anymore by the transistor performance, but by the parasitics. So 2D is catching up with the silicon, even in terms of the circuit. It's just that we have to now take care of this aspect. And we did it for all the different logic gates. And then eventually we thought about, okay, why don't we compare this 2D single instruction computer made out of 2D material with silicon FinFET, right? So we kind of used the most advanced silicon 7 nanometer, PDK, and all the BSIM bulk model for that. And you can kind of see these SS, TT, and FF are just simply we take the slowest NMOS and slowest PMOS from our 2D, and FF means fastest CMOS and fastest NMOS from our 2D, and the TT is the typical one, which is the median value. And you can see that the 2D instruction computer is only 10x worse than the most advanced silicon FinFET devices. And remember, our devices are still 200 nanometer to 100 nanometer channel length. Our EOTs are still not 1 nanometer. So we really have a lot of room to improve our 2D performance and really get to the performance of silicon devices. So we are not too far, and we are only 10 years into real exploration of 2D materials, especially the actual exploration has probably started in last 3-4 years, right? So there's a lot of promise in 2D material, and that's why we are using 2D for doing all these tasks. With that, I would probably end. These are all our publications. The 2D computer paper just got accepted earlier this week in Nature as well, so I'm very happy that that is going to come out. But if you're interested, you can look into these papers. But I think you can see our main philosophy is to go towards 3D integration with high performance and low power 2D devices, and maybe also bring into the mix some of these 3D nano membranes to develop new paradigm of sensing, computing, and storage, which is inspired by biological brains, animal brains, to really satisfy the need for both more, and more than more. With that, I would like to thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Thanks for a great talk. Thanks a lot. So we have time, maybe 10 minutes for questions. So any questions from the audience while I'll look online?
Hello. Absolutely inspiring talk. I want to change my research field. I guess so. When you present it, it looks so simple, but I guess how robust and how much knowledge do you need from a theory and from the AI side? Like, were you able to train up a graduate student, or did they have to almost have a completely separate skill set to be able to integrate within your group and do these calculations?
I think one thing which is important is to have a diverse range of graduate students. So I think some of my graduate students do have a little bit of background in machine learning, and then there are also students who have more more senior students who have background in mostly the device aspect. Because I think this kind of a marriage is very important for them to do the projects like this. So I mean, is that your question? I mean, what kind of expertise you need in order to do this thing? I mean.
Would you need a more expert group to be able to, like, let's say I collected that data, would I need an expert group to be able to apply that machine learning model, or do you think it's gotten to a point where an amateur could almost?
I think machine learning models are probably the easiest part in this entire thing, I would say, because I mean, they're all available. You can really, I mean, today any undergraduate that comes out can write all this Python code. They probably know this thing better than even me. I mean, but I'm saying the developing expertise in this kind of machine learning that we are doing probably doesn't require a lot of background in machine learning. What you need is a lot of vision for what you want to do with this data. For example, when we thought about, I mean, there's a lot of follow-up work we are doing in this graphene sensor work, right, where we are trying to identify, can you, train a machine, I mean, with the existing data on some contaminant with some known solution, and get the graphene device or the machine learning model to learn the signature of the contaminant and then test it in a completely unknown solution, right? So these kind of problems, I think, which were almost unimaginable 5 years back, are now possible with the advancement in the AI part, because all these models were not as much available back then. So there is a power of these machine learning tools, or all this ChatGPT and whatever evolution has happened can now drive or mitigate a lot of challenge that we face generally with this 2D material, or in general nanomaterial community, is what my feeling is. So we want to bring that expertise in this field, which already exists and pretty well developed.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So one question from our online audience. Considering the potential for large area synthesis, which 2D materials do you believe offer the greatest potential for immediate or near-term impact in electronics and sensors? And on that topic, can you maybe also comment a little bit more on the processing you did to the 2D material to get to your computer at the end?
No, excellent question. I think, well, there are so many 2D materials. So at Penn State, we have made sure we focus on couple, because if you start focusing on 10 different or 20 different 2D materials, because then you are completely defocused. So we have identified MOS2 because it's probably one of the it's probably the easiest one to grow. It has a lot of air stability. It's very easy to work with. So therefore there's a lot of optimization that has gone into developing MOS2 as the N-type 2D material. It's also much easier to make N-type contact to MOS2. So MOS2 becomes a natural choice. PFET still is a long-standing challenge in the field. So very recently we have got some exciting results with tungsten selenide. There are other candidates like molyselenide, molytelluride. Tellurides are more difficult to grow and also not very stable because they tend to oxidize. So selenide strikes a balance between the stability, how easily it can be grown, and then you can do some doping technique to get to high PFET performance. So that's why we have focused on these two materials. But I mean, tomorrow somebody may come up with a very new material. So recently there's a paper, I think, in Nature Materials about bismuth oxyselenide. That material also seems like promising because that has a native oxide, which is very high quality. These 2D materials don't have a native oxide like this silicon, right? So eventually we have to also think about integrating gate dielectric. So that remains a challenge. All the data that I have showed you over here are backgated transistors. Eventually, the computer has to be made using top-gated transistors. Top-gate will require you to have a very good dielectric on the top, and basal, the nucleation on this 2D material is going to be tough. So you have to innovate over there how to get a very high quality dielectric as a top gate. We want to minimize defect in this 2D material, but if you eliminate all defects, then you also cannot nucleate very well on the basal plane of this 2D material. So there has to be a lot of work that has to go in order to also optimize that. So we are also looking into a lot of 2D dielectrics, because then they can be put right on top of the 2D materials with a good interface. So there's a lot of optimization that has gone into to get to this stage, but I think there's still a lot more engineering challenges remains to be solved.
Thank you. Any other questions?
As graphene purity increases, do you foresee like N and P doped graphene as an option for P and N type?
Oh, I think graphene is definitely not a choice at all, because it doesn't have a band gap. So I cannot turn off my transistors, right?
Even when doped?
You can dope it. Doping will change the threshold, the Dirac point, right? The doping is not going to open up a band gap. So unless I open up a band gap in graphene, graphene is mostly not very useful for transistor application. It's very good for sensing though.
Thank you.
I was curious about the electron mobility of 2D materials as you stack up these structures into 3D, and is it really the MOS2 type of material that improves the electron mobility, and would you need to, I guess another way of asking is, how would you deal with the thermal profile of a 3D MOS2 and how you would cool it down,
Yeah, I think excellent question. So mobility numbers right now what we get is of the order of 10 to 20 in MOS2, and I think similar number for WSE2. Theoretically projected numbers are higher, so we should probably be able to get there as we reduce the number of sulfur vacancies in these films and have to reduce the grain boundaries and things like that. So mobility is probably, as long as I get to 100, I'm happy, because once you make the devices too small, mobility doesn't matter that much anyways. What matters is the contact resistance and the on current. So as long as I have a low contact resistance in a scale device, I should be able to get to high performance. And then when it comes to the thermal management, that's an excellent question. We are struggling to manage the heat in a 2D chip. So in a 3D chip, the thermal management is going to be even worse. So there's a lot of interest in looking into heat spreaders, right? So innovation in materials which can at least spread the heat if you cannot completely eliminate it, or you do some kind of a design where you do not really have a lot of hot spots. So your transistor or the architecture design can be some innovation can come over there. But that managing the heat in a 3D IC is going to be an emerging topic.
Thank you for your talk. And my question is, during the talk, you mentioned that the yield of the device is 10 to 20%. Do you have any idea how to improve?
No, I think the yield of the devices is high. So I think MOS2 devices, we can get to very high yield, sometimes even 100% yield. When we are trying to do these more complex circuits in a 3D architecture, then the yield goes down. And I think this is something, we are in academia, so as you know, we face a lot of challenges, because we transfer the material, sometimes the transfer doesn't go very well. Is the fact that, these 3D fabrications are not only easy, but also very expensive. So you cannot just go and simply repeat it just to get a 100% yield, right? So I think the proof of concept we demonstrate that it can be done. And then I think once it goes to the industry level, I think the yield problem should be able to be managed.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker again for a wonderful talk.